Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding, and you are once again listening to PreserveCast, and we're glad to have you back, and really excited to be talking about a sort of a unique museum and a unique way of doing preservation in a community. And we'll dive into that here in a second. But first and foremost, thanks to all the new listeners who are joining us here on PreserveCast. If you're enjoying what you're listening to, there's a back catalog of over 370 episodes. So certainly a lot to catch you up on. And if you are enjoying what you're listening to, we make sure we want to ask you to make sure to rate, review, subscribe, and share. One of the best ways to get the information out is to share with your friends. So on social media, we would love to get a share, and you can follow us there on PreserveCast as well on all the major platforms. Today's episode, we're going to be digging into a new exhibit called We Make History at the Anacostia Community Museum. And we're going to be talking with Dr. Jennifer Sieck, who is the acting curator at the Anacostia Community Museum. She holds an interdisciplinary PhD from the George Washington University. And we're going to be talking all about her work with this very unique sort of branch of the Smithsonian. But before we get there, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to and what led them to this line of work. So, Jen, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up and what led to your interest in history?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. And I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And I also grew up visiting relatives in D.C., as well as in my dad's native Baltimore and other places in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio. And there were a lot of history keepers in my family. My grandmother kept a date book that had family births, deaths, anniversaries that I now have. She passed that on to me, and we've digitized that information and shared it with the larger family. My maternal grandmother kept so many family dates in her head, but also showed me the family Bibles that had recorded births, weddings, deaths, etc. My great aunt did some genealogy work and passed those records on to the next generations. And my Aunt Joyce keeps a wonderful scrapbook of letters and other materials from our annual family reunions. So lots of different history keepers. And
yeah, I mean, it comes across that like there's like a deep love of history in the family. Not everybody has that level of sort of history keeping in the family. What led you to kind of take that and then go to the academic route, get your PhD? What were you hoping to do? What did you do when you sort of left to go to college? Was it right on the path to history and preservation and museums and all this kind of stuff?
I would say my path was more circuitous. I was an English major. Stories really spoke to me, and that's really my entry point into the field of history. Family members are great storytellers, and I was really interested in combination with that, how change happens. And in my dissertation, I was looking for sort of methodologies in literature and in film for how change is sparked. And it wasn't always through written language, but I looked for clues in the works, for example, of Frederick Douglass, who wrote 3 autobiographies, was one of our most prolific and eloquent history keepers. So I majored in English and then sort of eventually came towards a path that looked at the history of literature sort of in context. And,
yeah. And I'm curious, where was then the first job in the field after that? Was it more on the academic side? You're now at a very unique museum, and we're going to talk about that. But what was the first job in the field?
Really, the museum was my first job in the field per se. I had previously worked in the field of public affairs for a statewide transportation agency, a job that I loved, and I got to learn all kinds of things every day. And history was a big part of that. The history of transportation is critical to the nation's history as well as local history. I attended a dedication ceremony for an historical marker. That was part of my job. And it was for Brunswick Stew in Brunswick County, Virginia. And there was a documentary filmmaker who was making a film about foodways. So there were lots of different inroads, no pun intended, about history. And I was also fortunate to have an immediate supervisor who was a historian and actually published a history of his father's experiences as a surgeon in World War II. So I'm very fortunate to have mentors that have come from many different walks of life.
And for the record, what is Brunswick stew, and is it any good?
Brunswick stew, it depends on where you're from as to what the ingredients are, but it's almost a stone soup kind of stew that has vegetables and different kinds of meats depending on what area you grew up in. And there are folks called stew masters who are experts in their particular brand of stew. So it's a communal dish that's very popular in several places in the United States.
And I've noticed you haven't given it a thumbs up or thumbs down. Where does Dr. Sieck land on Brunswick stew?
Well, I'm a little unusual because I'm actually allergic to some of the ingredients. When it's made with chicken, I can't eat it. So if there's a non-chicken version, it's delicious.
Okay,
but,
sounds good. We'll have to. We like to touch on foodways from time to time here on the podcast. So sort of interesting. Always curious about that kind of thing. And speaking of foodways and culture and community, some of that is the work of where you are today. So you're the acting curator at the Anacostia Community Museum. For listeners around the country who aren't familiar with it, and for that matter, even listeners here in the DC metro area who aren't familiar with it, talk to us about the Anacostia Community Museum, because not only is it a unique place, but even its founding is unique. Maybe give us a little bit of the background on what it is and why it was created, and then we can talk about sort of the work that it does and this particular exhibit.
The Anacostia Community Museum was founded in 1967, and it really embarked on path-breaking museology, which is the fancy word for the practice of crafting museums and exhibits and all of the many intricate parts that go along with that. So the Smithsonian had been interested in bringing a museum to the southeast portion of Washington, D.C., which is across the Anacostia River. And the initial idea was to bring the Smithsonian on the Mall, as many of us have visited, to the neighborhood. And in fact, the first exhibit opened up with some objects from, for example, the Air and Space Museum or National History Museum. However, part of the reason that the museum landed in Anacostia is because residents were eager to have a museum in their neighborhood and advocated for it. And quickly, those residents began to share their family histories and community histories with staff at the museum. They shared documents, photographs, objects, and a series of oral histories was conducted, which again was groundbreaking and helped to form the basis of an exhibit called the Anacostia Story, and preceding that, Evolution of a Community. It retold the history of Anacostia in a more full way, and no one had done it quite like that before. The museum then and now works in partnership with the community, and so our visitors see themselves in the stories that we highlight, whether it's their neighbor or their teacher or someone they grew up with. And that personal recognition in a Smithsonian museum allows us to tell these stories in a very organic way.
And how groundbreaking was it? I mean, people think maybe in their head, well, we have a local historical society. How is this different? And why did the Smithsonian buy into it? And why have they sustained it?
This was, a formalized effort to bring stories from the community in partnership with neighborhood residents into exhibits. And that is still not the typical way that exhibits are done. Often a curator will research, select objects, and it's not necessarily in conversation with people associated with those objects. And that was very new, that practice. And the staff wrote articles about that, presented about that at international conferences. And there are museum professionals who have come from across the world to come visit the museum and see how this practice has, what this looks like. And it was around the time of the museum's founding, was also a time when, for example, the Studio Museum in Harlem was being founded, the Tenement Museum in New York. There are others that, in part, in context of the era of the late 60s, were beginning to tell people's stories in a very different way than had been in the past.
So how different is the museum for the average visitor when they come in? Is it is it a traditional experience, or is even the experience sort of non-traditional? What kind of exhibit galleries do you have, and what stories are currently being told? And then we'll jump into this new one that's being launched.
It is in many ways a traditional experience, although we tend to have interactive portions of each exhibit that may be more immersive or robust, I think, than perhaps a traditional museum. We are a small museum with essentially one gallery, and so the museum will reopen actually with the launching of this exhibit. But people will come into the gallery space, and this new exhibit is designed in 5 sections. And so you wend your way through those 5 sections, and in each section there's an interactive experience, one that we hope will inspire visitors to become history keepers if they are not already. And we will even have some cards at the end so that visitors can extend their visit by going to local archives or historic sites and exploring history that's hidden in plain view all around us.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea, and I love how it connects to other sites around it. So the exhibit's name is We Make History, which sort of a perfect time. We're in the 250th, and I think a lot of people are thinking about history. And I think a lot of times when we think about history, we think about it being something in the past, but every day that passes, I suppose, is another day of history. Talk to us about the idea behind it, and then maybe we can talk about how you created the exhibit, because even that is unique at the Anacostia Museum in the way that you pull exhibits together like you were describing. So tell us a little bit about it and then the process for creating it.
We Make History is designed to emphasize this participatory element that we together make history. Each of us individually have stories to tell and to share, and the exhibit takes stories from our collection partly to show what Washington changemakers and history keepers have done in the past as a way that we can learn from their experiences, but also their methodologies. So the first section, for example, provides a foundation and a lot of tools that are still relevant today, or we can see how they can be updated, going from a diary, for example, to perhaps keeping a daily record on social media.
And did you work closely with the community on kind of talking about ways in which people are doing that now? And what does that community engagement process look like? And I ask not just because I'm curious about your process, but for people listening who are thinking, okay, I run a historic society or I have a small museum, I want to do more of this kind of thing. What's like a best practice? How does this work?
Certainly. Our stories range from the early 19th century all the way up to the present day. So to give a couple of examples of present day, one of the stories that we tell is about the Fort DuPont Ice Hockey League, which is based in Southeast DC at the Fort DuPont Ice Arena. It's the oldest minority hockey league in North America, not just in the United States. And it was started in 1978 by Coach Neil Henderson in his driveway to gather neighborhood kids in a sport that he learned to love growing up in Canada. And we have a hockey puck from the Fort DuPont ice hockey cannons that will be on display. Part of the process is how those objects come into the collection. They come in conversation with Coach Henderson, for example. And then ACM, the Anacostia Community Museum, has a program called Coffee and Collections. And people associated with those objects come to the museum, and the objects are on display, and we have a conversation about the stories behind those objects. So last September, Coach Henderson and two of his other coaches, Coach Featherstone and Coach Lee, came to the museum and gave a wonderful presentation, and our registrar pulled other objects associated with the Fort DuPont cannons. And this is an ongoing conversation. We've just been in touch within the last week with community members about another story. And it's a process that helps us clarify the stories also when we have information that's come in with an object. And then happily, we often can expand that. And if there are facts that need to be corrected, we can amend those and bring more people into the conversation.
Would you say that it's necessarily, or not necessarily, but oftentimes the case that this is more recent past so that you're able to connect to the actual people behind it? Or is it a balance? Because like you're describing a situation where you have a living individual who is a part of this historic event. I mean, we're all part of historic events. I get that. But do you kind of cover all types of events associated with Anacostia history, or do the exhibits sort of tend to lean more towards the recent past just because of the way in which the community is engaged in the process? What does that look like?
It actually can extend back quite a ways. The Anacostia story exhibit covered 1608 to 1930.
Okay.
And in We Make History, the one of the centerpieces to the exhibit is a diary that was started on May 30th, 1841 by Adam Francis Plummer, who was enslaved at the time. And the exciting thing is that, of course, we cannot know Adam Francis Plummer directly. However, when the diary entered the collection, our archivist, Jennifer Morris, worked with a descendant of the Plummer family, Reverend Jerome Fowler, and still last summer, descendants of the family came to the museum, and we are in conversation with them. And the opening of the museum will include a panel about the Plummer family diary. And Maya Davis, who's the director of Riversdale House, where Adam Francis Plummer was enslaved, we'll talk about descendants, and that's still an ongoing conversation because of the history keeping that Adam Francis Plummer and his daughter Nellie Arnold Plummer did. We just discovered that there's a connection between another Plummer descendant whose collection is in our archives. So it's really, even with something that's so, we might think of as quite old and inaccessible, it's still, we can still connect to living people today for whom that's meaningful, and learn more and expand our knowledge.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And is the diary itself, talk to us about the significance of that diary. I mean, it's obviously super important to Anacostia history, to the history of this area, but this has national significance, right?
Correct. Adam Francis Plummer started the diary on his wedding day. He and Emily Saunders married on May 30th, 1841 in Washington, D.C. And he kept this diary throughout his life. He passed away in 1905, recording deaths, weddings, anniversaries. There were letters between family members, lists of household possessions, community history. And once he passed, his daughter, Nellie Arnold Plummer, continued the diary. And it's likely the only example of a multi-generational diary started by an enslaved person in the United States. So it's really special.
Yeah, and I'm curious, some people listening might be curious because they've heard that in many cases, codes in different states where slavery was present prevented the enslaved from learning to read and write. How did that play out in Plummer's case?
Adam Francis Plummer learned to read from a relative at Riversdale Plantation in Prince George's County, Maryland, and we believe that relative was a Black minister, and he taught his children to read also, so that when his daughter, Sarah Miranda, was sold to and had to be, anyway, it was sold and ended up in New Orleans. She wrote back to the family, and they were able to eventually go back to New Orleans and find her and bring her home.
And that has to be one of the few examples that we know of that happening. I would imagine. I mean, certainly people were trying to find their families, but sort of a written effort to do that is singular, or at least really, really important in the history of slavery in the United States, and sort of stands out. So I can see why you would want to chronicle this story in Plummer. So that's a big part of the exhibit. Will the actual diary be on display? Can people see it? And maybe, as you hope, it will maybe inspire people to keep a diary of their own.
Yes, we hope it will inspire people to do just that. The cover of the diary will be on display. The individual pages are too fragile to put on display. However, they have been digitized, and so visitors will be able to look through them on an electronic device in the gallery and see what it was like.
So, I mean, obviously, the diary is a really important and interesting, fascinating, and significant piece of the exhibit. Are there others that you would call out? I mean, it's hard to beat that, but are there others that you would call out as? I mean, the puck is cool, as someone who likes hockey, but what else could people expect to see if they come? And then we'll make sure that we have a link in the show notes to more information on its opening and everything like that. But what else are you excited about in the exhibit?
Well, as I said, the first section is sort of foundational, called On the Record. And one of the other stories and history keepers highlighted is Carter G. Woodson. And Carter G. Woodson actually published letters from the Plummer family diary in the I think it was 1926. And there'll be an image of that in the exhibit. Nellie Arnold Plummer took her parents' letters to Carter G. Woodson, and he published them in the Journal of Negro History. And so we highlight this history keeping that started long before our museum, but a tradition that not only we continue, but we hope that visitors will be excited about. Also in this section, we highlight Ethel Payne, who's a journalist, and Dorothy Porter Wesley, who was the librarian and curator at the Moreland Spingarn Research Collection. There's an evening bag in the section that belonged to her that has beautiful peacocks on it, and she was known, this very elegant librarian with a master's degree from Columbia University, as the bag lady, because she recognized history even if it might have been in a dustbin, a trash can in the administrative hallway at Howard, and she would rescue documents and put them in the archives because she knew that that was important and didn't want to lose that history. So in the second section, which is about history and place, I think a lot of Washingtonians especially will love to see Chuck Brown's guitar, who was known as the godfather of go-go. And we look at Chuck Brown Memorial Park, which was dedicated in his honor and has a sculpture. Artwork is another way to keep history of Chuck Brown doing his famous call and response, holding the microphone out to the crowd. Also in the third section about sports and history will be a jersey that belonged to a Washington Spirit player, soccer player, professional women's soccer player, who helped to advocate for equal pay and made change that resonated nationally as well. There's a basketball also in that section that belonged to Coach Wanda Oates, who introduced girls' sports into the DC school system, and also coached varsity basketball, varsity boys basketball, winning multiple championships and really breaking new ground in that way. And another object to highlight in the fourth section, which is about history and the arts, is Marian Anderson's fur coat. And of course, this Marian Anderson was a commensurate artist, was known for having a voice of the century, such a powerful and beautiful contralto. And of course, in DC, she is very well known for her concert at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, 1939, which made history in the civil rights movement. And so that coat reminds us that she was outdoors because she was not permitted to be indoors for that particular event. And we think about Marian Anderson and also Washington, D.C. photography studio, the Skurlock studio, which captured that event on film and has bequeathed many beautiful images, many portraits of American history that we can now treasure as touchstones and help to remember history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you've got some really, what an interesting variation in the collection too. I mean, everything from a hockey puck to this incredible diary to Marian Anderson's fur coat. I mean, there are touchstones of American history and there are touchstones of the community, but all unique and important in their own right. You know, I'm curious, one question we've been asking folks about the 250th, we're, quickly approaching the 250th anniversary of the nation. It seems to me like this was kind of planned with that in mind, sort of thinking about how, that's a seminal moment of history. So how do you document your own story? Is that perhaps a takeaway from this is that one way that we can commemorate the 250th is to make sure that we're documenting history? Is that a fair takeaway from the way you're approaching the 250th?
That is our hope. Exactly right. And the idea is to highlight different ways that people can do that. So maybe your way is to keep a diary, but maybe your way is to keep sports statistics, which is a tremendously popular and important form of history keeping. Maybe your way is to write a song or take a photograph. That there are many different ways that people can participate and plug into documenting our lives so that we can remember the past and also shape the future.
I love that. That's a great way to put that. I'm curious. We ask everybody last question. If you have a favorite historic place or site, what's a place you can go back to over and over again?
I love to visit Cedar Hill, which is Frederick Douglass's home in Anacostia, and that will also be part of the exhibit. If you haven't been, I certainly recommend. But Douglass was one history keeper that I look to as someone who used multiple methods for making change and history, from music to writing to, of course, oratory. And to photography. He was the most photographed person in the 19th century. So he really took new technology, photography was new technology at the time, and used it to try to advocate for better lives and a stronger democracy for everyone.
Yeah, well, I mean, hard to beat a Douglass site. What a wonderful place. And What a cool conversation, not only just to learn about this great exhibit that's coming up. And again, we've been talking with Dr. Jennifer Sieck about her work as the acting curator of the Anacostia Community Museum and a new exhibit opening this May called We Make History. But not only is it great just to kind of hear about something, a coming attraction, but also for people around the country to think about their place in history, how they maintain history, and how leaders in the preservation and history communities can use some of these skills and tools to do some of this work in their own museums and their own historic sites to engage the public. So I think it's been sort of a learning lesson for all of us. Jen, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with the opening.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was just a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.